CFL 110, your weekly trip around the biggest stories in the Canadian Football League with Jeff Hamilton and Andrew Hustler Paterson. Presented by Garage Living Winnipeg.
Hey, what's up, everyone? And welcome to, for one final time this regular season, with you. And we don't have a packed weekend of football coming up for meaningful games, but we have one massive one, and depending on what happens in that game, potentially two. We're going to get to all of it. Stories coming out of last week in the Canadian Football League, award nominees for MOP, and more over the next little while. It is great to have you with us. Of course, CFL 110 all season long has been brought to you by our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg. Gang that pushes on as the leaves turn and fall. The pushes on have that clean, organized garage this fall before the snow flies. You can still do it, though. Give Garage Living Winnipeg a call at 204-999-1234. Our pal Pat's been very busy over the last little while. As soon as back to school hit and the bikes and the hockey equipment and the football equipment were all over the garage, it sounds like they've been getting a lot of calls. Hey, Garage Living has an innovative solution for all of that. It's called Slatwall. Dozens of hooks, baskets, and shelves that clip into it to get everything off your floor. There's even a cool golf club caddy and tire racks to store those winter or summer tires. And the cool thing is you can do as much of it or as little of it as you want to fit within your budget. Don't miss your chance to clear the clutter, organize and beautify your garage with Slatwall. Garage Living also offers polyaspartic floor coating and made in Canada premium metal cabinetry for a total garage makeover. Check out their amazing work and what they've done for other Garage Living customers on their website at garageliving.com. And give Pat Kanuga a call, 204-999-1234 to book a free in-garage consultation or make an appointment to see him in their showroom at 981 Main Street. Garage Living Winnipeg, garages made for living. Hammer, we're just about at the finish line of the regular season. 4 games left. How you doing?
Doing pretty good, man. I mean, what a season it's been. What an exciting season it's been, owing to the fact that CFL 110 has been a part of this year for the first time. So it's wacky weeks in the CFL, and in fact, it's quite common. But to have this, have the wacky storylines that we go through every week, and have the parity that we've seen this year. I mean, usually this weekend's a nothing burger. Usually everything's kind of figured out by now. The standings are worked out, and while there is a lot of places that have been figured out in those standings in the East and West, we still have that battle here on the weekend. So there's still something to play for this weekend, which is I'm thankful for, but ultimately thankful for getting the opportunity to do this with you each week, Huss, and breaking down this wacky game, man.
Man, it's been such a great season, and listen, cannot wait for the playoffs. As you mentioned, The East is set. We know it'll be Ottawa, Toronto next week, with the winner going to Montreal. Very much up in the air in the West. We know BC is going to be on the road next week. Do they go to Winnipeg? Do they go to Saskatchewan? We'll find out, and we'll get to all of it. But coming out of last week, we have to start with the Lions story. We've been talking about this quarterback situation in Vancouver all year long. VA getting hurt in that shutout beatdown the Bombers put on the Lions to kind of start their turnaround. Nathan Rourke starting that week, and just never really getting the results that I think we all sort of expected with his return to the league. Last week, in what seemed like a bit of a Hail Mary on the season, Rick Campbell turns to Vernon Adams, and they looked like the team that was tearing up the league in the first 6 weeks. I mean, over 500 yards of offense, a resounding 27-3 victory. What did you think of VA, and does this change your opinion of the Lions going into the playoffs based on this one game last week?
Start off with VA's performance. Look, it was awesome. It was great to see a player who, got the ugly end of the stick, or, whatever you want to refer to it as a situation, short end of the stick, whatever. This is a guy who was put into an awkward situation. was in the midst of an MOP caliber season, regardless of his, tire fire of a game against Winnipeg and that 25-0 loss, and was put into a spot where like he felt, man, that this was his year. Like this was the year that Vernon Adams was going to come alive. He was going to be considered among one of the best players, if not the best player in the CFL. With the BC Lions hosting the Grey Cup this year, don't think for a second that Vernon Adams flying out his teammates in the offseason and working with them closely didn't have a lot to do with this big season ahead with them and hosting the Grey Cup. And to have that all come crashing down with the signing of Nathan Rourke. So not only losing your job in the present, but losing your position with an organization that you'd come to love, at all, losing that entire position because you ain't going to be around past this season unless something crazy happens. So to have all that happen and then have to wait for 8 weeks, I know he got in on that half a couple weeks back, but to see a guy struggle for 8 weeks, to see your teammates, which I'm sure were in his ear throughout this process, talking about how they wish he was, behind center. If it wasn't clear, it was certainly clear after the game, Huss. If you listen to some of those guys talk, they were referring to this as Adams's team. A guy who had been on the sidelines for the better part of 2 months. It was his team, and how, look at how they played. Look at how they showed up for him. Look at how the receivers got open. Look at the energy. Look at the excitement. Look at, VA brought a lot of that, right? Against a Montreal team that, yes, is not playing for anything right now. And we can get into that in a bit. But, it was an all-around great effort. Look, I asked you this last week, Huss, what Vernon Adams would have to do to not get the start in the playoffs. So the fact that he's going to be starting for the West semifinal is not surprising to me. To answer the question, do I feel better about the Lions heading into the playoffs? I feel slightly better because I think there's a little bit of good juju mixing around in that locker room. And I think a lot of guys are willing to play hard for Vernon Adams, harder for Vernon Adams than they would for Nathan Rourke. So all of those things matter as far as the BC Lions' chances. But unless they can get a new defense, unless they can get a better O-line in the next week, I see this as a one more game for the BC Lions. I'm more than happy to be, eat crow and be surprised, but I don't see the Lions being a better team. In fact, I see a lot of soul searching for this management heading into the offseason after a loss in the West semifinal because of a team that couldn't rally around a great quarterback. And I there's a lot to that. And, we talked about the job that Rick Campbell has done, with this quarterbacks. And I mentioned last week that I felt he bungled it. And I think there's a lot to suggest that he has. If you look at the timeline of Nathan Rourke, though, there's a little bit of a defense for Rick Campbell. When they brought him in, Vernon Adams was injured. Okay, so it was him or Jake Dolegala. I think that's a pretty obvious decision. Nathan Rourke doesn't play that great. Kind of gets his legs under him the second game, but not that great. But then goes out to Victoria. Are you sitting him in Victoria? Where he's from for Touchdown Pacific? No, you're not. And he lit them up out there. He had a great game, and then rebounded with a win over Montreal. And at that moment, I think the BC Lions thought they had their quarterback of the present and the future. So
I did too.
So to me, I think there is defense here. I just think it's just, I don't know, man. I'm not buying the Lions. I wasn't buying the Lions with Rourke, and I'm not buying the Lions with Vernon Adams. Where are you at with all this?
Okay, so listen, I was so out on BC the last couple of weeks. And for obvious reasons, you just went through them. They did not look like a championship caliber team. And frankly, they didn't look like a caliber of a team that could go toe to toe with Winnipeg or Saskatchewan. And maybe the most damning performance of it all was a couple weeks ago in a game that was so important, home field on the line. They no-showed and got their asses kicked. And at that point, I was sort of writing them off. I've come around a little bit, though, after seeing Vernon Adams. And listen, I think there is something to be said about the energy that he brings. And listen, these guys are professionals. They're supposed to be out there doing what they can do for whoever is in the lineup that night. But I'm sort of with you. It looked like a very different team playing with VA than the guys that went out there the week before with Nathan Rourke. Why that is, there'll be a big autopsy on this team, and we'll be talking about this season for BC for a long time. However, I will say this. If the BC Lions can come out with that same sort of energy and vigor led by VA last week, I think they're far more in the conversation to make things interesting in that West semi, regardless of where they play. And, we'll get to the Bombers and what's on tap for them this week in a minute. If they take care of business and we do get a rematch, it's going to be fascinating to see. I mean, we just saw these two teams play a team that had a game that had playoff implications. I do think it'll be a lot different, and I do think we'll actually still be watching the game in the fourth quarter as opposed to that one, which was basically over when they got out of halftime. So I'm not willing to say that they are completely dead. I do think it is a crazy long shot for them to go on the road to both Saskatchewan and Winnipeg, or Winnipeg and Saskatchewan and win it. But I'll tell you what, with Vernon Adams out there, I think that West Semi is going to be a lot more tightly contested than maybe it would have been. We'll get to the Bombers in a minute. But let's move to the preview of the East Semi that we saw last week. Listen, Toronto was running away with that game, and Ottawa did come back and make the score look better, but to me, that was lipstick on a pig. We did not see a lot better from Ottawa. I mean, they kind of got back into it when the game was over. And listen, Toronto coming back off that massive defensive performance they put on beating the Bombers here in Winnipeg, I think showed that their offense is clicking. I talked to Paul Appolise earlier today on Winnipeg Sports Talk, and he said, even though you look at the standings for the season, the Argos are down at the bottom, he's very, very impressed with their passing game. We know what their defense can do. Ask Zach Caleros. To me, I think the Argos might be the most complete and dangerous team in the East right now, heading into this game next week for a chance to go to Montreal.
I think you got something there. I do. I think that Toronto, I don't think teams are scared of Toronto. I just think they have the right pieces and the right style and strategy to win when it matters the most in the playoffs. Look at the things that matter at this time of the year. I mean, you talk about it after the Labor Day weekend about the need to be able to run the ball and establish that run game. Well, the Argos can do that. They have Kadeem Carey, they have McMahon, they have, I can't pronounce his last name, so I'm not going to try, but they have a 3-man monster there that they can bring in, highlighted by Kadeem Carey, who is having a resurgence of a year after those great years in Calgary. He is a dangerous weapon. They also lead the league in sacks by a significant margin, by double digits to the next team. And that's, again, a testament to the work in the trenches. The trenches matter in the playoffs more than any time in the season. And if you can win the battle of the trenches and you can play smart football, something that I think could challenge Toronto. We know that they are a talented team. We know that they have, talented players in all position categories, but they need to be a disciplined team. The only team that I think that they can lose to, and this is going to sound super cliche, is themselves. If they don't play disciplined football, and by disciplined football, I don't just mean penalties. I mean tightening things up when the game goes on. Now, I'm going to give Toronto a pass for that game against Ottawa. When you go up 28-0 in a football game, you tend to change the way you play. The defensive coordinator is certainly telling you to be in front of the ball. The last thing you need is to get beaten deep in a game where the opponent is so desperate to play catch up that they're going to try to beat you deep. They have to. So you give up yards in that. You give up space in that. And while, especially at the end of the game when Ottawa, and again, kudos to Ottawa, we'll get into them, but when you have to go back to back to back onside kicks, it's great that you recovered those back-to-back kicks, but who on Toronto is diving vulnerably for one of those balls on an onside kick in a game they're leading by multiple touchdowns? I think you handle the onside kick much differently if you're Toronto, if this game is within reach. I don't see it as Toronto just not able to recover these. I see a team desperate in Ottawa to get the ball, and again, credit to them. But Toronto at that point in time had it wrapped up. I know it got super interesting. I know the CFL never ends, it seems like, but I'm not worried about Toronto. I think they have Ryan, with having Ryan Dinwiddie as a coach. I've said this before on this show and other shows. I find him to be one of the smartest football minds out there. You give him time to plan, he will get that extra week. We saw what it was like when Toronto came off the bye week and played Winnipeg, who were on an 8-game win streak. Winnipeg looked nothing like that team. that they had, at least over the last month. And that was with the extra planning and strategizing by Ryan Dinwiddie and his staff. They're going to get that benefit playing in the East Final, they're not going to get that benefit hosting the East Final, but they do have a good coach. They do have a good coach who will set them up to succeed. And I think that's the biggest difference for Toronto. And if they can, if they can obviously punch their ticket to the East Final, we talked about this, I got that feeling that it's going to be payback time for Argos.
And listen, I would say right now, and we'll, lean on the guys at Coolbet maybe to see what a fictional line would be in an East Final right now between Montreal and Toronto, who by definition would have just come out of a win at home. I think this will be close to a pick'em. I mean, I think right now I could make an argument that the Argos should actually be favored based on where they're at. One team that I know won't be favored is Ottawa. And this team now, just to your point on last week, I mean, listen, it's great to get those onside kicks. Having to recover multiple onside kicks in a game is not a path to victory. It might make the game look a little bit better, but that ain't winning you a championship. That ain't winning you in the playoffs, and that sure as hell ain't getting you to the Grey Cup. This team was a great story this year, Jeff. They had that awesome start at 8-3-1, but right now they've lost 5 games in a row. They haven't won since late August against these Toronto Argonauts. And he just seemed to have been taking on water as the season has continued. Is there any reason to think that the Redblacks season does not end swiftly next week at BMO?
There are way more reasons to suggest it will than it won't end. And I think the part really where it won't end potentially is if Drew Brown can play the best game of his career. If he can play similar to the guy we saw earlier in the season when he was routinely throwing for 300 plus yards a game, even entering the 400 yard realm, I believe on 1 or 2 occasions. He needs to take over a game. And I think the good news for Ottawa is that Drew Brown hasn't played a lot of football recently, obviously with Jeremiah Massola playing in relief. He needs to get back to that comfort level. And I still think that that's what this, last little bit has been part of, getting him back on the field. I don't think people were expecting him to necessarily throw the lights out last game, but he will be expected to be incredibly effective in that East semifinal if the Redblacks are to win. But there are so many more reasons, Huss, to argue that they won't. And, whether it's that game, whether it's going down 28-0 in a game that was so significant for your playoff standings, whether it was trying to crawl back, and, falling short, there's good and bad to that. Obviously, you don't want to get your lunch money stolen the way they had their lunch money stolen out of the gates. But you got to give them a little bit of credit for coming back in the game. And maybe, just maybe, that gives them the sliver of confidence heading into that.
Hey, they certainly didn't quit.
They didn't quit. They didn't quit, for sure. But I don't know. I can't think of, beyond Drew Brown, Huss, help me out here. Why would you think? I mean, Adarius Pickett is a massive loss on defense. Special teams, I love what Khalil Pimpleton's been doing. I mean, if they could just get the effort from that guy and replicate it across the dressing room, yeah, you might have a fighting chance. But convince me why Ottawa Redblacks have a shot here.
Listen, I don't think they have much of a shot. The only way I can see Ottawa winning this game in Toronto next week, and again, we'll dive into the matchups and everything more, but I mean, to me, there's one script, and it is a defensive performance far beyond anything we've seen lately that wins probably convincingly the turnover battle. Maybe Chad Kelly has the yips in a playoff game after what happened last year. And you mentioned special teams. I think they have to clearly win the special teams battle. Kicking has to be great. Maybe you bust a big return, and maybe you get fortunate with the guy on the other side not having a great game. Other than that, and it really does start on the defensive side of the ball and that defensive line. To me, Toronto is a much scarier team. And they'll be a big favorite next week for sure, and will be the likely team that plays the Montreal Alouettes. Let's get to the main event. And this is the game this week because the Winnipeg Blue Bombers can clinch home field in the West and a bye next week with a win. If they don't win, Saskatchewan has the opportunity at home to Calgary to leapfrog them, sit out next week, let the Bombers and Lions go at it, and host the West Final at Mosaic. Jeff, this is this is a game with so much on the line for one team and really nothing for the other. But while the Bombers are 8-1 in their last 9, despite losing their last game and know exactly what is at hand, Montreal's in a weird situation in that they already know they have a bye next week. You definitely want to have your team as healthy as possible for that East semi when you're playing either Toronto or Ottawa. But I think there's also a concern with the way this team is played. They got shellacked by BC last week and did not look good. And I think it's very clear that Montreal Alouettes' best football so far this season has been in the first half of the year. So what do you make of the challenges that Jason Moss has when it comes to the decisions as to who plays, how much they really put into this game, the old rest versus rust question, knowing that there's a chance they might play the Winnipeg Blue Bombers later on in Vancouver in the Grey Cup game, and a win against them would definitely make their path to get to that game a hell of a lot harder, potentially preventing a Grey Cup rematch.
You have to think results have been secondary these last few games. It's been about getting the guys the reps they need, whether that's Cody Fajardo returning to the lineup this past weekend and getting that full half of play. I don't think, all those things you mentioned, Huss, they're all true. We haven't seen the best football from the Montreal Alouettes over the last month, and I don't think it's a coincidence that they wrapped up the East pretty much 3 weeks ago. And, I don't know if we can look at results for them and suggest that they're not going to play well. And here's the other thing, Huss. If all those things start working against them, if people start talking about the Alouettes not being the best team in the East, how do they do with a chip on their shoulder? How does that team do when they're betted against? Because right now, everyone, for the most part, beyond this month, everyone talk about how great the Alouettes are, right? How great they are. I mean, and maybe there is a benefit here. The other thing too, as I mentioned, you made a bunch of great points about where the Alouettes currently are at. Are they going to fix that all in a week? Like, is it going to be like all of a sudden, they send out their starters and their best players and they play the game of their lives in a game that means nothing. They beat the Winnipeg Blue Bombers, force them to wait it out a game with the Riders. And all of a sudden the Alouettes are now Grey Cup favorites. Like, yeah, maybe to the media and to fans. The focus for Jason Moss is the East Final right now. Your preparation is for the East Final. Yes, you got to play these games. Yes, you go through, studying your opponent, putting, execution out there. I just don't know how you ramp it up in games that don't matter. And as much as Jason Moss would want that from his team, I know he wants it from his players. It's just impossible to manufacture high stakes. Like going into a game, we are all human. Going into a game like the East Final or the Grey Cup is way different than going into the final regular season game at home against a team that really, really needs it. You don't need it. Yeah, you haven't been playing your best football, but the results aren't there. So you can get jacked up and excited, and guys will. And I'm sure the Montreal Alouettes are going to play hard. I just don't think they're going to play all their weapons for the entirety of the game, and to fix all those perceived issues isn't going to happen in a half. I really think, you mentioned the odds right now have Montreal as a touchdown, Bombers as a touchdown favorite, and that might seem high. I don't know if it is. The Bombers are going to be going out balls to the wall. Mike O'Shea is going to be playing Zach Collaros and Brady Oliveira the entire game. Even if the game is, 2-score game with 45 seconds left, I still don't think he removes it because of what can happen in this league. And that's what's going to happen. Do you really, as Jason Moss, want to put all your best players out there and get them, hammering each play and everyone's dealing with something, as we know, and get them playing again balls to the wall in a game that doesn't mean anything? Not really. So I think you talk a big game in Montreal. I think you say all the right things, but when push comes to shove, I see this as being a pretty easy game for Winnipeg. I just do. I don't think players are going to take risks that they would take in bigger games. And while I don't think they're going to play soft, I do think that's going to have an effect on the overall game. And so I think the Bombers walk to this one.
The worst case scenario for the Alouettes is going into this game and having something happen to an impact player that impacts them for the East Final. We saw Fletcher and Austin Mack sit out last week. I mean, do they just keep those guys where they are? Did they play them for a little bit? I mean, the thing is, you can't put guys in bubble wrap out in professional football. If a guy's in the play and he's in the game, he's fair game, and they got to be ready to play.
Yeah.
So I'm fascinated by how Moss handles this. Like, to me, that 7-point spread that we're seeing at Coolbet right now on this game speaks to the situation that the two teams are in, and they're very, very different. The Bombers are playing this like a playoff game. Like, they have to have it. And I think there's big questions as to what we'll get from Montreal for the full 60. And I think you make a great point. I mean, there absolutely is a scenario where they go out for the first half and play as hard as they can as if it's a playoff game. And then, okay, we got the reps in, guys. Now we're putting in some backups, and we handle it very differently. And that's why. Because, I mean, listen, at full strength in Montreal, based on this season, I mean, the Bombers have played great as of late. They've probably been better in the last 2 months. Like, maybe you can make an argument that'd be a pick 'em or they would be a slight favorite. They're not laying 7 on the road in Montreal against the team that's done what they've done so far this year. So it really does speak to that. And, you know, you kind of nailed where O'Shea's at. Zach Caleros is going to be starting. Brady Oliveira is going to be getting a ton of touches. I mean, this is a game with so much on the line. They'll be bringing their best. And, of course, the Bombers, like the Riders, who we'll get to in a minute, had their bye last week. It was the shortest bye possible. This team has been practicing since the weekend, getting ready for a game that will have massive implications on their quest to get back to the Grey Cup for the 5th straight year as the representatives of the West. Now, someone's playing BC next week. It's either going to be in Winnipeg or in Saskatchewan. The Bombers have the advantage, and if they win, it is in Winnipeg, which brings up a very interesting point, and I kind of all point to the point spreads again. Well, the Bombers are laying 7. The Riders are only laying 3.5 at home. That, to me, says that the books, and the line will tell you that as well, the books expect the Winnipeg Blue Bombers to win, which then I think completely changes what Corey Mace does in this game. I mean, if the Bombers win, they know they're playing the following week, Jeff. And at that point, I don't think Trevor Harris sees the field. Armstead, Ouellette, Milligan. They've got a lot of guys that have played well. Like, if you know you've got a bye week, maybe things are a little different, but they won't have that luxury right now. So to me, because honestly, if the Riders were at home to Calgary in a game that if they win, they host the West Final, they might be 14-point favorites right now. And vice versa, if they're not laying anyone out, this game's a pick 'em or whatever. And this line again says that the Bombers are likely to win, and that really changes. But, listen, just a big picture for the Riders right now, who had that terrible stretch in the middle of the season, but have really turned it around. And maybe the exclamation mark was the resounding ass-kicking they gave BC, led by Nathan Rourke a couple of weeks. How dangerous of a team is this right now, regardless of whether they have to play next week and then come to Winnipeg if they win, or have the luxury of waiting and hosting the West Final?
Yeah, first of all, I do think they're dangerous, but I want to address one thing. Like, the Riders, they won't have the luxury, right? They have to set their roster the day before. So they'll have to put their rosters in by 10 a.m. on Friday. Now, they can play this game a little bit of like, oh, there was an injury here. And you have like up to 90 minutes or something, or an hour maybe, to make those substitutions. But you can't just have here's plan B, right? Here's plan B for if Bombers win the game, we're actually going to go with this lineup. So like an hour or two, you all of a sudden have, 10, 15 substitutions. That's
We're not
not
expecting 11 game time decisions for the Riders?
Not. And the other thing too, Huss, is you can't really do that, right? You can't. There's a couple of
teams aren't carrying 50 extra guys.
You're not carrying tons of extra guys, right? And the guys that I spoke to in Winnipeg, they all wanted to play that game this week, regardless of what is happening. So you have to deal with that. There'll be players that are saying, absolutely no way I'm sitting out this week. I need to play. I need it for my rhythm. I need it for all those things. So there's going to be decisions that are made outside of, just where you were at in the standings. Of course, in this situation, the Riders could, if the Bombers can't get the job done, they find themselves in an incredible situation to beat a bad Calgary team at home to take over that top spot in the West. I don't think that's going to happen, but the Riders remain scary nonetheless. I think the Riders have much like is the case with Toronto, they have a great run defense. They have a decent O-line. Now they've been battered on O-line, so it's actually been a better job than you could have imagined. But Trevor Harris is solid. That's they have solid quarterbacking. I like, AJ Ouellette is now back. I mean, they ran him through the ringer for how many weeks until he got injured. Well, he's now back at the perfect time to establish their run game. As I mentioned, they have great run defense. I like their receivers. Tough that Sean Bain's out for the year, but you have guys like Keyshawn Johnson stepping up. You have guys like MLS have been doing it all year. Kean Schaefer-Baker. Like, you just have guys that are making plays. And you need that in the playoffs. And so you add in Mario Alford and special teams. Now, I know Mario Alford was a bit of the GOAT in that Labor Day Classic game, but he ain't going to do that twice. So that he's going to have his P's and Q's taken care of when it comes to returning the ball. He can be a dynamic guy. And then you factor in, I am looking ahead here, obviously, when they play Winnipeg, but it's a very tough place to play at Mosaic Stadium against BC, and if they can get past BC, which I think they can, defeat the Lions, maybe not in the same fashion as a couple weeks ago, but nonetheless can do it. If they play Winnipeg, even if it's in Winnipeg, this team is battle tested in the weather, and anything can happen. I don't need to tell you this. I don't need to tell anybody from the two provinces or anybody who covers or watches the CFL that anything can happen between the Winnipeg Blue Bombers and Saskatchewan Roughriders. And that's what makes this game so exciting.
Yeah, the Riders are different this year. And we've talked about it all season long on this program and on Winnipeg Sports Talk. They are a different team with Corey Mace leading the way, and they had a terrible run, but we saw this team's identity really come together, and credit to them for not completely coming apart when things weren't going well for them. And I was just so impressed with the beating that they put on BC. And I'm right there with you. Listen, for people in Winnipeg and Bomber fans, it has been really fun to own the Riders for the last few years. It's a great rivalry. The games in the regular season are monstrous in both of the cities. And the Bombers have had their way with Saskatchewan for the last number of years. This is 2024. And yes, they were 2-1 against Saskatchewan. And yes, they won the Labor Day Classic and they won the Banjo Bowl. Those games were very, very tight games that could have gone either way. Now, listen, good teams, Chiefs in the NFL are a perfect example of this. They're blowing anybody out? No. But they're in control. They find ways to win. And the Bombers have always been great at putting their opponents away. It is going to take a great effort for a full 60 minutes to beat the Saskatchewan Roughriders come playoff time. And listen, I think for CFL fans outside of BC who would love to see their team in the big game, regardless of where the West Final is played, another matchup between the Bombers and Riders would be absolutely classic and definitely will be must-see TV. Listen, we said we were probably done talking about Hamilton last week, but we should mention them. Little bit of it was a big time beatdown of Calgary, and Levi Mitchell puts an exclamation mark on his season with 450 and 5 touchdowns against his former team, the Calgary Stampeders. He goes over 5,000 passing yards on the season. Many thought Bo was done last year. He got benched earlier this year. Many thought that was it. What do you make of the season that he's put together, even on a team that did not make the playoffs? And what's the future for Bo Levi Mitchell? Because I don't know, at certain points this year and even last year, I didn't know that we would be talking about Bo in 2025, but it's pretty hard not to be talking about with the way that he's slung it this year.
I want to mention one thing about that game first. I thought it could have been even worse. It was 30-0 with 2 minutes left in the half, and somehow, some way, they managed to score. The Stats managed to score 9 points, including a Trey Roberson, pick 6 touchdown. But I find it so what a moment for Bo. He had his family there. He had his wife and his daughters. I believe he had his, siblings there, and the family took pictures afterwards. He couldn't get it done in Calgary earlier in the year. They lost that game, obviously, early in the season. I believe it was first game of the season. I know he was disappointed, obviously, after leaving Calgary to not deliver some of that revenge at that moment, but certainly got it here, man. 5 passing touchdowns, 450 passing yards. It's funny because I don't even know if that's the craziest game of his season so far. He's going to lead the CFL in passing yards for the first time in his career, Huss. First time in his career. There's a guy who was a perennial MOP candidate.
That surprises
for all
me.
those years in Calgary. Yeah, it really does. I memean, but you also got to remember they had some pretty good running attacks in Calgary during those years as well. So they were the definition of a complementary attack there. But as for his future, Huss, I'm so curious what happens to him. In my conversation with him in Hamilton a few weeks back, in the midst of his, playing some of his best football, where he was moving back into the MOP conversation, my biggest takeaway in that sit down with him was what he told me at the end when we were talking about his career. And this, of course, I'll remind viewers here and listeners that he had almost lost his job to Taylor Powell like a month earlier, a few weeks earlier, and was only back in the driver's seat because Taylor Powell got concussed 3 plays into his first start in replacing Bo, and that put Bo back in the seat. And of course, he's played the great football. But anyways, back to my point about what he said at the end was he felt like his play this year has kind of changed the narrative heading into the offseason, where if he wants to continue playing, he will continue playing. And it sounded like he had a spot in Hamilton. But mostly he didn't necessarily say that. He said that he doesn't have to essentially beg for an opportunity for a comeback. So Bo, in his mind, whether it's in Hamilton or somewhere else, believes that his career in the CFL will continue. And I'm just very curious if that will be in Hamilton. I don't know if it will be, and it will be wild to see him potentially be nominated as the East, representative as MOP. I don't think Bo's not going to win the award this year. It's going to go, we'll get into that after. It's going to go probably to the West. But if he gets nominated as MOP out of the East, throws for 5,000 passing yards for the first time in his career, leads the CFL in passing for the first time in his career, was mobile more than he's been in the last 7 or 8 years, suggests that he should come back. But will Scott Milanovich want him to be back? Will he want him to be the leader of a team that couldn't make the playoffs in a league that 6 of 9 teams make it? At the end of the day, it's great that you had quality play from Levi Mitchell, but when you are the Hamilton Tiger Cats and you're going through what you achieved this season, that's one of the few things that worked. And so unless Bo comes back, he already chopped his salary. I'm so curious. I don't have an answer. Personally, I don't believe he's back in Hamilton. I just don't believe he will.
Let me throw this at you. I know a team that could use a 5,000-yard passer that had very, very mid quarterbacking this year.
My smile rising.
And they happen to be in Calgary, Alberta. Like, listen, depending on where the Stamps go from here,
oh my goodness,
how about bringing in a young quarterback or a couple young quarterbacks that you feel could benefit greatly from playing under a veteran quarterback like Levi Mitchell, and have Bo come back for one more swing to try to get the Stamps back to where basically they were every single year when he was the guy?
Honestly, the more you talk about it, the more I absolutely love it. It would be so CFL if he could go back there, man. But there was I'm not saying I don't know this. I don't cover this team. I obviously have connections in Calgary. I'm lucky enough to be the only guy really traveling across the league for the last few years. So I get to see players, talk to players, coaches, GMs of different teams or whatever. So I'm not going to say this definitively, but I don't think the exit for Bo was all that great. And I think when Bo reflects on his exit, I think he's grown and matured a lot in these last 2 seasons. I think he's matured as a player, as a person, as a competitor, all those things. I'm not saying he was immature, but it was just a different deal there. And I think it would be uncomfortable for Levi Mitchell to go back to Calgary and talk about this is the way things are going to get done. And I know that sounds a little odd for a guy who spent more than a decade there. He's arguably attached to their most successful time in their tenure as a CFL franchise. So it's not like he doesn't have, fans wouldn't necessarily welcome him back, all that stuff. I think that stuff would be fine. I just don't think it's a position that he wants to be back in and have Dave Dickenson then control his future again, right? I mean, you mentioned, like, do you think he's really going to want to come in and teach the up-and-comers in Calgary? Maybe he will be. I'm not saying he wouldn't be, but why would you want to go through that process again in Calgary where, like, you had great times, you said goodbye to the city to come back only to then inevitably lose your job again? But I love it.
The only thing is, it might be the best offer out there. Yeah. And I think, listen, if Bo's back next year, I think no matter what, he has to go into that situation saying that he's the guy, but knowing that he doesn't have another 5 or 6 years of his career. And listen, if you want to do right, of course not.
He's year to year, no doubt about it.
Yeah, if you want to do right by the team and the people in the organization that's paying you and entrusting you to be the number one guy, I think it would be assumed, and you would have to, play the good soldier and be part of the solution long-term after you're done.
And he's kind of played that role the last 2 years. I mean, he got injured the first year in Hamilton, but he hasn't really been, he's been the guy, but he's gone through those feelings of kind of not being the guy, being the guy. So I agree with you. I do think that muscle memory that didn't exist before does exist now, and it would be an amazing story. Here's the other big takeaway, and I think it applies not just to Bo Levi Mitchell, but it applies to Trevor Harris. It applies to McLeod Bethel-Thompson. It applies to Zach Collaros for sure, and you saw some of that this season. If you're going to bring these established, experienced quarterbacks back into the fold, into your mix, you better have a damn good O-line. And I mean a damn good one. And that's been one of the biggest differences for Bo Levi Mitchell in recent years, is playing in front of a solid O-line. They have a solid O-line in Hamilton. They do. And so he was getting time and space. So anyone who, whether this is known as a buyer's beware for the teams out there, Huss, I heard this from the horse's mouth in Bo Levi Mitchell. Now, he didn't say to me, I need a big, a great O-line to be able to play the way I've been playing this year. He didn't have to. He started by saying all the credit goes to those guys. He's no longer thinking as a quarterback. This is what he said. He said, it's amazing as a quarterback when the first thing you're thinking about isn't where the pressure is coming from. When you can think freely, look at it as, going through your reads without worrying where that pressure is going to inevitably come from, which was certainly the case in his last few years in Calgary. But again, that can apply to any quarterback, but you do have younger, more mobile quarterbacks, a la Vernon Adams, who can, do special things with his legs to extend plays and to make up for shortfalls in your O-line. You can no longer do that with Bo Levi Mitchell, and I'd argue any of the experienced quarterbacks that have been in the CFL now for years and years.
Just speaking of Bo, just before we wrap, he is part of a group of players that were announced today as the finalists for the MOP. Defensive player, the Canadian, the lineman, special teams, the rookie. We'll have lots of time to get into those conversations over the next couple of weeks with only a couple games. Mm-hmm. But we've been talking about MOP all year. Here are the nominees. Justin McInnes from BC, Eugene Lewis from Edmonton, Reggie Begelton from Calgary, Roland Milligan Jr. on the defensive side of the football. We've talked about the amazing season he's had from Saskatchewan, and the bulldozer in Winnipeg, Brady Oliveira. From the East, it's Bo Levi Mitchell. It's Kadeem Carey from Toronto, Justin Hardy from Ottawa, and it wasn't Cody Fajardo, who was the favorite most of the year. Tyrese Beverette also.
You might be the most surprised individual in the entire country from that result.
You know what? Well, I'll tell you what. I think the bookmakers maybe more than anyone, considering what we saw the odds were all year long. And I guess we go now. I mean, pretty hard to imagine Brady Oliveira not getting the nod. Although Milligan, I think, what the Rider defense did this year has some real steam. The fact of the matter is the votes are already in, right? So, if Saskatchewan won the West on the back of the defense, the votes are already in. I do kind of think that those should be done after the last week of the season.
Well, to be fair, no, they're not, though. They're not. I kind of put my foot in my mouth a little bit last week.
So the nominees are out.
Like, the votes were in last week for the team nominees.
Yes.
So what happens here for viewers? So the team and there's room for discussion. We'll get into this in a future show about where the award show should probably go and change or whatever. But as its current format, it's 4 voters from the Football Reporters of Canada and the head coach of each team, and each local market votes for their club's nomination for each one of those awards. Yeah. So the awards were in last weekend. So they were actually in a week ahead, but only for the awards for the individual teams. Now the next round of awards, and this is where things change. So the markets in the West, they vote for now the West nominees for all those awards. So all those FRC members who voted individually for local clubs, they're back to voting, and then the national voters come in, and I believe there's about 10 or 12 of those. I should probably have a straight up number for you, as I'm the FRC president for the last several years. But that's what happens. So, but those votes are due in on Sunday. So technically, you could make your vote today for the the West MOP, in my case, the West MOP and all those awards, or you can wait to the end of the weekend. I would advise waiting to the end of the weekend if you feel like you feel like it's close. But so it will be representative of the votes, hopefully, assuming that all the voters wait till Sunday to cast their vote.
Well, I'll tell you what, Brady Oliveira, because of the situation the Bombers are in, is going to have a real chance to put an exclamation mark on his candidacy. And I think what happens in that Bomber game will determine whether Milligan has a chance to make an impact in a meaningful game for the Saskatchewan Roughriders. We'll get to more talk on the awards, as I said, in the upcoming weeks. Before we wrap, Hammer, this is the way the lines are looking. I know we sort of mentioned them a couple times with these games that involve the Bombers and the Riders this week. But there are 4 games. We've got a doubleheader on Friday, one more for the Tiger Cats. They're in Ottawa. And Ottawa is just a 1.5 point favorite against Hamilton. You know the Ticats are going to want to play with pride and finish strong. Toronto is in Edmonton. The Elks are 1.5 point favorites in this game. Again, Toronto's going to have some decisions. Do they rest guys? Do they play backups? I mean, we'll see. They're hosting the East Semi next week. Edmonton's going to be done and making tea times elsewhere. Bombers and Alouettes. This is the game of the week, 2:00 Winnipeg time on Sunday. 7 point favorites are the Bombers, and that one's gone up throughout the day. And then this game, Saskatchewan's 3.5 point favorites, as I mentioned. They're probably 13, 14 point favorites if this game was before the Winnipeg game. The fact that it's afterwards indicates that, there could be some different guys playing, and it is very much up in the air. A wild final week in the Canadian Football League, and then it gets real next week. Hey, a huge thanks to our friends at Garage Living Winnipeg for their support of CFL 110. If you'd like to get a little bit more information on how they can completely transform and revolutionize your garage, get over to garageliving.com and see the examples of the amazing work that they've done for customers here in the middle part of the country and across Canada. And if you are in Manitoba or Saskatchewan, give our pal Pat Kanuga a ring, 204-999-1234 to get more information on what's possible. And he'd love to pop by and give you a free in-garage consultation as well to find out what might be possible with your space in your garage. A Hammer, been a great regular season on CFL 110. I cannot wait for the playoffs. Have a great weekend, and we'll look forward to talking to you next week when we're getting ready for the semis in both divisions.
Yeah, right on, man. Another great show, another great week of 3-down football, and it's only going to get better from here. And that's the most exciting part. I'm really looking forward to doing those shows during the playoffs and at the Grey Cup, Huss, in Vancouver. I mean, that doesn't get much better than that. I can't wait to talk about this. I'm going to be stirring this boat of Calgary pot all week in Vancouver. I cannot wait for it. That's going to be that's going to be a fun story, fictional storyline, if anything. But hey, it's a fun thing to talk about. Yeah, we will be in Vancouver for the Grey Cup. We might, depending on traveling, we might do the show on a different day, but we'll figure it out. There'll be so much awesome. There'll be so much CFL action information and news and everything, you won't even know what day of the week it is.
You know it. If you're from outside of the market, don't hesitate to jump over to Winnipeg Sports Talk on YouTube, or you're finding it here. Give a sub. We're talking a lot of CFL on a daily basis, in addition to the Jets and hockey and everything else going on at Winnipeg Sports. But make sure to join us next week for our first playoff edition of CFL 110. Just before we go, a special thank you to super producer extraordinaire Michael Remus, who is going the extra mile this week, not in Winnipeg, making this episode the final one of the regular season available. So
bravo, Remo.
There's a lot of love. People have really been missing Remo in the WST chat this weekend. I've let them all know he will be back, and actually it'll be he and Connor Rabchak tag teaming while I'm away on Friday and Monday of the upcoming weekend. But tomorrow we'll be live, more on the Bombers and Alouettes at 1 p.m. on Winnipeg Sports Talk. Pop on over, join us on YouTube. You can find that wherever you get your favorite podcasts as well. Hammer, have a great one. Thanks for doing this. Thanks again to Remus for making the show possible today. Thanks to Garage Living Winnipeg and all of you CFL fans coming out and hanging out with us on CFL 110. We'll catch you next week, everybody. Enjoy the games.
You've been listening to CFL 110. Tune in next week for more great Canadian football discussion.